I apologize that we were running behind. We have a brand new board with us, and there are a lot of questions that members have, and we want to make sure that we give them all the courtesy and benefit that they need for that. So we appreciate you all allowing us the extra time that we needed earlier. Without further ado, we'd like to go ahead and get into the workshop discussion. And Dr. Boone, if you'd like to go ahead and open us up.
Good afternoon. We have with us today, again, from Cooperative Strategies, Tracy Richter. And the goal of his conversation with the board today is really to again, as we have a newly constituted board, that gives some historical perspective of where we are and where we're headed with some of the work, the major work around educational planning. So we appreciate Mr. Richter for coming to Norfolk right off his vacation. So welcome, Tracy.
And thank you, members of the board. Thanks for having me tonight. My name is Tracy Richter, for those of you who don't know me. We've been working with Norfolk Public Schools almost 6 years now. And our background for our company, we started here when we were at DeYoung Richter as a company, as you may know. We focus on K-12 facility planning. It's all we do. We don't work with colleges. We don't work with other entities. We stick in K-12 and we just do planning. We're not architects. We're not engineers. Our foundation is programmatic, education, demographics. And you know, when we came in here 6 years ago, some previous planning had been done, but we actually initially came in, as many of you know, in a demographic study to look at enrollment and capacity. And here we are 6 years later talking about, you know, sweeping changes and really moving MPS forward. But, you know, planning, we talked about this today, and what you're going to see tonight, maybe in the book in front of you. I kind of joke to say, let's open up to page 1, but we would be here a really long time. This is going to take a while to consume just because there's a lot. And sometimes it feels like almost like drinking out of a fire hose sometimes because there's just so much information there. But planning, especially in complex urban areas, is like taking a blank piece of stone and starting to carve around the edges until you get to the fine details of the features that you want to see in your masterpiece. And I think planning is a lot like that, especially in complex areas that that have changed and will change and continue to change and evolve. That will do a continuous improvement, that have seen change, but now we have a real pathway of a lot of things coming together, which I think is very exciting. So tonight what I'm going to share with you is a historical context of where we are from where we started to where we are today. You're going to see data on the pages, but tonight the data isn't as important as why we use that data and how we come to the conclusion on that data. So we'll talk about things like enrollment and projections and enrollment. The projection is what it is, but I want to tell you why we do projections the way we do it, to give it, and this is some reiteration, but it gives you some context and foundation for as we get to some real meaty issues when fall comes and we're going to go out and work with community members and we're going to make some real hard and some good decisions, but hard decisions as we move forward. So I think that tonight is really about that context. I'm very open, as many of the board members say. I take critical analysis well. I challenge a little bit because I hope that that's what we want. We want good dialogue that makes us better as a group. I feel like at this point with NPS, I'm kind of an extension of the staff here, although I still do a lot of national work and bring that to the table. So I hope you'll challenge me with that as we get to know each other better, as we do planning and have to do these things. So here's my clicker here. So basically, we'll look at some history and then go through some relevant data and then and look at some of the summary of the recommendations. But planning is complex, and that when you make one decision in planning, it has a domino effect of what we do. We don't have the luxury of staying within and making a decision on one school without thinking about 35 other buildings here, because they all matter. And when you make a decision on one, that starts to happen. So on the foundation of planning, we've often used the analogy of the stool that has 4 legs on it. That, you know, between educational framework, budget, enrollment and demographics, and then cost and community input, that's a stable stool. And you start to ignore one of those legs in the stool, then everything starts to get wobbly and starts to fall apart a little bit and starts to wear down. And so we see all of these as important, that there's no piece of this that isn't important. But here's what you get when, and I feel like this is the biggest challenge of any school board I have the privilege of working with, is that through the year you get bits and pieces of information. You're going to work on budget after the first of the year. You're going to get enrollment information in the fall. You're going to get program information and your quality analysis in the summer. So you're going to have to take all those pieces that you get all through the year to make big decisions, when it seems to me if you put it all together, that I think the foundation of those decisions on your part, because you don't have to pull from all these different sources. Facility planning in our case tries to do that. We try to consider what programs you're going to initiate, what you're trying to do. We're trying to look at the condition of your facilities and how that comes into play. We're trying to look at the demographics and the enrollment and the changes that shift within your city, and then your enrollment per school. We're trying to put all that together so we can hand you something to make a good decision from the same talking point, not some 4 or 5 different times in the year. So our data analysis really does focus on things like facility condition, demographic information, program information, all those kind of things that and a lot of it, and a lot of that data is hard and fast. It is. It's right there in front of you. We know how many kids are in that school. We know how many have been there. We know the capacity of that building. There's other things that are really hard to measure. You know, quality of the educational environment. We measure that. We measure an educational adequacy of your schools. But how do you measure that? How do you say that this building is an appropriate educational building? Well, and there's different perspectives. So we have to take all that in consideration. The planning that we do, we make an attempt as best we can to be transparent. Now, everybody that ever went through a planning process or a community process will tell you transparency is, I mean, we're not going to knock on every door because we can't, but we're going to advertise, we're going to go to schools, we're going to walk into the communities, and we're going to go talk to people, and we're going to listen to people. And we've been doing that for 6 years. You're still going to hear people that say, you've never been to my community, I've never heard you put on a meeting, and they're all there. So we try to make it as transparent as possible because we think that, again, everybody working from the same data set is critical to this. Funding may have been the biggest challenge that we've faced in the last 5 or 6 years here, obviously. We've talked extensively about how funding impacts what we do, and I'm going to show you a couple things tonight on funding that matter. That part of working in the Commonwealth with school boards is that you don't have a lot of authority when it comes to how much money you get every year. But that's just part of the system you work in. Okay, so we deal with that. So a lot of our role is preparing the board for the ask. Is that when you go to city council, that you're prepared with, this is why we need this, and this is why these dollars are important to make our division a successful school division. So a lot of the job that I have is preparing this board and the superintendent to make sure that when you're going in that budget cycle that you have the information you need from our side, so if they have a question, we can answer it. And so that ends up playing a pretty big role in here. How we began is, again, it was a demographic analysis. We examined a lot of the options of the utilization of facilities. We walked every single building, walked every single space to determine what the capacity of a building is. Now, the first thing you should know about this is that the capacity of a building is dynamic. The capacity of a building will never, ever stay the same. And there's reasons for that. The biggest reason is programmatic. That, for instance, the easiest example to make is that class size standards say that special education classrooms have smaller class sizes than a regular ed classroom. If you add a special ed classroom into the building a year that wasn't there previous, we're going to reduce the capacity of the building because that's what the program demands, is reducing the capacity of the building. So we do an analysis on facilities that does both a design capacity that shows you if you had to stick every kid in the building you could, here's your number. But if you want to do it programmatically, here's your number. And that's why a number becomes dynamic. That was our first obstacle in here. And then obviously trying to identify those opportunities for expanded services and programs that you have out there. You know, things like pre-kindergarten, and then, you know, having the discussion around choice seats and how do we do that better. And so it became more of a process that really everything about it, it looked, smelled, and tasted like facility planning, but it was called a demographic analysis. So the findings of that were a lot of boundary realignment and attempts to do some boundary realignments that we started, but weren't very extensive because they couldn't be. It would be way too much to consume in the community to make dramatic changes to the system and without shocking it too much. And so the implementation of some things, even the reconfiguration of schools, sometimes it was about capacity, sometimes it was looking at attempts to make programs better and more efficient. Again, under other leadership, and then as that changes, visions will change and things like that. And so we looked at closures and consolidations, as we always do, and then at that point, Campus Stella was still in development. And so that became a priority discussion that we had. But our planning objectives have never really changed. They've stayed steady as we've gone through, trying to make sure that we're always looking at excess capacity. I think Dr. Boone expresses this. If you ever see her talk to City Council about excess capacity, it's complicated, because even when people say, well, you've lost 500 students, look, you don't lose 500 students in 2 schools. You lose it across the district that has 30,000 kids. And when you do that, 500 across 30, 35 buildings doesn't mean that there's all this dramatic excess space out there. Now, this division has closed schools in the last 15 years. Don't let anybody fool you. It has closed school buildings. And it hasn't been easy, and that has huge impacts. We continue to look for efficiencies when it comes to how we do our facilities. Closing schools isn't a fun thing to do. Nobody thinks it, and actually for school districts, it's bad business. Our business isn't to close schools. Our business is to maintain schools, maintain enrollment, to do that. And so when you have to do it because demographic shifts or enrollment declines or anything like that, but it has to be done. It's part of the process of how districts change. So that excess capacity, and you're going to see most of it's at the middle school still. We don't have a lot of excess capacity anymore in elementary schools, and especially in high schools. So we address that. The imbalance of live-in enrollment. So, we have some schools that are overutilized. We have some schools that are underutilized. And how do you continue to balance that in both boundary and choice solutions? Also looking at imbalances of economically disadvantaged student percentages. So what we focus on there, and the only way we measure this is that is the only measurement we have is reported data on free and reduced lunch counts. So that's how we measure socioeconomic. Now, I will tell you right up front that measuring socioeconomic by just that stat can be a bit deceiving, because first of all, it's a self-reported data piece. So you have to apply for free and reduced lunch. There are people out there that don't apply for different reasons, whether they don't know how, they don't know the process, their pride, there's all kinds of reasons. And what also happens is that as students get older, and this happens everywhere, is that reporting gets less. So you'll see that a high school that's in the same feeder pattern has a less free and reduced lunch count on paper, but that might not be the case. So we have to make some assumptions in planning, because we know that in a self-reported, there's going to be some data that gets missed. And so we don't overestimate it, because we look at things like city data, we look at population data, we look at housing data, we look at all those things to make sure that we're as accurate as we can be. Continuity in feeder patterns. One of the things you're going to see in this recommendation is that we need to clean up feeder patterns. We need to say that there's an established continuity of when a student enters into kindergarten in this division, that they know their pathway. Now, their pathway can change, but that should be their choice to change. But when they walk in, they should know their pathway through schools. And so we have schools right now, and I'll give you the example I gave in the June 6th presentation, Coleman Place Elementary. When they leave 5th grade, they go to 4 different middle schools. And when they go to high school, they go to 4 different high schools. So from K to 12, that population of students can go, I don't even know the algorithm to tell you what 4 to 4 means, to be honest with you. But what we're trying to do then, and it's not going to be overnight, it is going to be a transitional period, is look to make clean feeder patterns. When students start in elementary, they're going to go as a whole to middle school and go to a whole as high school, unless they choose to go to a different pathway. So they're going to be, so people know their pathway. Also, it leads to good accountability, good budgeting, all those that can be better. So that's not going to be easy to do. Address aging facilities. I think kind of the final piece to our puzzle that the board sanctioned last year was a facility assessment, a condition assessment of facilities, an extensive review of walking into buildings and truly looking at the systems of the building and where they stand in their condition. And the number's staggering. The number is staggering. It's $500 million in deficiencies right now. And It's not for lack of trying to get to every building that we possibly can. But at the budget that gets set for facility improvement every year, the gap just keeps getting bigger. And without some sort of influx quickly, it's almost to a point where it can't be caught up with unless we address it sooner than later. And then obviously just addressing the community as we move in this process. We've worked with steering committees in the past. For 5 years, we've had an established group of people. It's changed, it's evolved. We're going to continue that discussion in August with a task force, a community task force that's made up of citizens all over the city, representatives from the city, representatives from different civic organizations in the city, trying to get a real great heterogeneous mix of the city to represent this task force. So let me give you some background on general demographics. Foundationally, the decline in enrollment can be most attributed to decline in births. There's a direct correlation that as birth has declined over the last 15 years in Norfolk City, that enrollment's declined, which again just makes sense. The less kids that are born here, so you have what we call in established enrollment projections, we call it a survival ratio. So how many kids are born here versus how many kids show up in kindergarten. And then we also do a measurement for how many kids are born here versus how many kids show up in first grade. Because not every kid shows up in kindergarten, because there's still some churches out there that still serve kindergarten kids, and so we understand that. So we do both measurements. And what we have found is that the percentage of birth decay has remained steady for the past 10 years. About 70% of the kids that are born here show up in your schools. Now, that number hasn't changed, but as birth rates have declined since 2008, and they will continue to decline, you're going to just naturally have less kids show up in kindergarten. And that's simple math. And so, but keep in mind, this is everywhere. Virginia Beach, right next door, they're down 2,000 students from 5 years ago. Declining birth rates. That's all it is. Their kindergarten enrollment is a lot less than it was 5 years ago. And so everybody's doing this. And keep in mind, last year, the initial estimate across the nation is 92 million less births in this country than there were in 2016. It's only going to continue. So we know that that decline is attributed to that. And so what we need to then predict is how then we project enrollment out there. So you can see over the last 10 years that there's been a decline of enrollment around 4,000 students. Now, again, I can show you with the spikes and all that. We can get into that detail later. But enrollment projections, the key here is to know how we do projections and how you will see student data as we present it in planning. So on our side of the table, we do projections by where students live, not by where they attend school. And there's a reason for that. That doing an attend projection is volatile in what we have to do in a long-term projection for facilities and capital. And the reason for that is that you all can make a policy change that says, you know what, this school is going to become this, and instantly the attendance changes because you change the policy of how those students can attend that school. That will blow out my enrollment projection by the swift mark of a pen. So an attend projection for me to do facility planning really doesn't do me any good. Now, Mr. Fuddy over there does your attend projections annually, and his has purpose. His purpose for projections is to do an attend projection for you so you can look at budgeting per school for resourcing, staffing, and all that. So there's a financial purpose to his on your everyday operational stuff. Our projections are where kids live because we know that movement impacts facilities. And where kids will be born or where they're going to live becomes really important to us about how we plan schools in the future. So whether it's a new construction or a consolidation of a school or moving of a boundary, all of those things get impacted by where kids live, not where they attend. And so we'll do it. Now, we do match them up. So we work with Mr. Fuddy on this to make sure that, because when we both roll them up, we want to make sure that we're about the same number. And guess what? We are almost dead on every year now. Our data is so deep and so good because we've been working in it so long that we're almost exact when you do the roll-up. We're just different on some areas because, so when you see plans that I give you, you'll see, whatever, Tidewater Elementary, okay? You'll see that I'm going to give you a projection that says this number, but you're going to look at it and you're going to see that the attendance is different than the number I gave you. And the reason for that is because I'm going to give you how many kids live in the boundary, and he's going to give you how many kids attend. And so how that works for us is then we can start create analysis about how to create more and better choice for you, if that's the desire of the board. And that's the desire of the leadership, is that, and we can strategically do it to make sure that we're balancing enrollment, holding our initial objectives. And that's our goal, is to hold on those initial objectives. So we look at enrollment in a lot of detail that a lot of people might not look at. And then we're going to look at the ebbs and flows also. So we know that you've got a bubble that moves through, and at times you're going to feel pressure in certain areas. But if you can withstand that pressure for a short time, because we know what's coming behind it, you don't have to spend your money on more capital because you know you're going to get through that in a short period of time that you may be able to accommodate by shift of a program or throwing up a portable for a year or doing something that is a lot more economical for you to do to solve your pressure on enrollment for a short period of time. So that's why this becomes really important. So we do a live-in analysis in this capacity, and this is where I was going earlier about how much capacity we have in the district. Based on the 2016-17 numbers, okay, and so, or 2017-2018 numbers, sorry. Looking at these numbers, basically where we're at is at the capacity to the live-in enrollment. Now that's important again, but the live-in enrollment is pretty close to your attend enrollment overall. Because keep in mind, there's 110 students that live within that go to this division that don't even live in Norfolk. So you get that. So you got that impact that happens. Optimally, I'll tell you where we think you should be. At the elementary grade level, we think that 85 to 90% utilization is a nice sweet spot. And the reason for that is that if you've got that kind of gap in that capacity, it gives you a little flexibility. But it doesn't keep so much capacity that you have to maintain a lot of excess square footage. Now, when you get to the middle school and high school, 85 is about the cap. And the reason for that, and I'll move on to the high school discussion first because I think it's an easier explanation. So we do analysis that do room-by-room analysis and hour-by-hour analysis of capacity. And what we have found is you can see something on paper that acts a lot different than how schools are practiced. Because if I look at anybody who's ever taught or led a high school in this room right now, they're going to tell you at 80%, they're full. And the reason for that is because the way they schedule and have to schedule when you have to serve every ninth grader English, you're going to have 30 or 32 kids in an English class. But then you're going to turn around and you're going to have 12 people in the advanced chemistry class because that's the only time you could schedule that block. And then the next hour you get 10 in that room, and then the next room you're going to have 32 because everybody has to take that course. So how you schedule high school and how that works within a building allows a principal some flexibility in how they're able to do that, even at the middle school level. Still on a junior high kind of schedule. When you get to teaming, it's a little different, but it allows some of that flexibility to happen. As you can see in middle school seats, there is still an excess amount of middle school seats. We have addressed that in the past. We've done it through grade configuration changes. We've done it through consolidation of middle schools. But we still have a target that there's a lot of excess seats. When you're talking about 3,000 empty seats, basically what we're talking about is just build Ruffner, maintain it, light it, mow it, do everything you got to do to it, but never put a kid in it. But you're paying for it. So no taxpayer wants to hear that. You know, and that's not, and the fiduciary responsibility of what we have, that's not a good way to maintain space. And so we want to make sure that we're trying to level that out. And we can do that different ways. It doesn't mean consolidation all the time. It can mean reconstitution of that space. It can mean changing the grade configuration. It can mean a complete different grade configuration in the building if you want to. And so I think that that's why this is important. And you can see then where they all kind of fit in the mix. Actually, your K-8 schools are right about their target. I mean, they're probably, frankly, too full, to be honest with you, because it's hard to get flexibility in that building when you're at 100%. Now, I think that bodes well for discussion about why K-8 fills its buildings. I think that warrants its discussion. It doesn't mean it's the total answer, but it certainly means that we explore why that happens in planning. Socioeconomically disadvantaged. Across the division, there's an average. And so I think that if you look at the division-wide average, it sits around somewhere around 65%. You see it varies a little bit as grades are there. What this does, and you can see it more on your sheets than you can up here, but it identifies the schools that fall within a 5% range of the division average for that grade level. And so, again, one of the keys here is that one of the difficulties of planning is trying to figure out when a city evolves as it has, and development has happened, or subdivisions, or planning, housing gets planted in different parts of the city, the only power we have is to react to it. It's difficult unless we start to shape the other way around, which we work toward. And so, but everybody wants to think that, a balanced school is 50-50. Well, that math doesn't work here. You're 65%. So if every school could be 65%, you'd be balanced. But that's not going to happen because we'd be transporting kids 2 hours across the division. And so, but what you try to find is that balance. And again, the only way to do that is to figure out better strategies for if we're going to replace schools in the future, locating them in the locations they need to be, to offer that opportunity, to offer choice programs or choice seats across the division that everybody wants to come to. And I get to that where, and we've had this discussion a lot, I believe true choice means that the neighborhood school is your choice. That it could be the school in your backyard is every bit as good as every magnet program you'll ever go to. That's choice, and that's what we work to. So trying to balance this in the context of when city does planning and their housing planning and their economic planning, and trying to coordinate that isn't always easy. And we are starting to work, and we have in the past, but now we are getting more tightly aligned with the city and how they do planning and the information that we share, so we can plan better too, as can they. Because they know the impacts of this. So once again, the feeder pattern analysis that we do is that we want to make sure that we're getting some continuity out there. And you can see out there the number of, like, in this chart in particular, the number of elementary school feeders that feed into 2 or more high schools, 3 or more high schools, 4 or more high schools, and then the same thing. And once again, when we're finding that schools split too often, or they have too many schools that come into it, this becomes a problem. I mean, neighborhood chemistry and that social chemistry is real. And we know how that can be. I think that one of the things that we saw, and this, again, I'm just stating a fact, and there's no judgment on this, but with Lafayette Winona, there were 11 elementary schools that fed into that building. 11 different neighborhoods, 11 different elementary schools, 11 different principals, umpteen numbers of teachers that they tried to get into one building in 3 short years. That is difficult to do. Ask a middle school principal trying to deal with all of that has to come together. So you're never going to build enough middle schools to have smaller units to come in, but when we're taking 11 schools into one building, it will be difficult to manage the personalities that walk into that. We have difficulties managing a 4-person family, let alone 11 different schools walking into. And so what we're after is this idea that we want to be very conscious about how we feed the schools to the next level. And it's not just about numbers, and it's not just about how many schools to what. It's about diversity. It's about program alignment. So not only should we get the capacities right and get our buildings to maximum utilization, we should align our programs to feed each level. That when the middle school principal is talking to the 6 or 7 elementary schools that they're going to serve, they're introducing that early into the elementary curriculum to say, this is how we're going to feed the program through when you choose to take your pathway through your neighborhood. Again, that only makes sense to a lot of people because then you can see that direct accountability. To track a student from kindergarten at Coleman Place all the way to high school would be like trying to follow a spider web. And so how do you account for for everybody who's responsible for that student's education? How do you account for that? And so we try to avoid that by doing better alignment of this. It's changed over time. Nobody's at fault for this. Because what happens is we do something here, we make a small adjustment. We do something here, we make a small adjustment. And all those adjustments in time mean that the alignment gets weird. And until we make a big correction, we can't get back there. And so again, it's a holistic approach about how we do planning, where if we're going to look at schools, it's going to be, and so the next we'll show you a chart of some of these schools. I'm not going to leave that up there because it's blinding to me. But the next one just shows you those percentages of how many kids are going to which schools. The last thing I'll show you on data is what we do is it's called a live-attend analysis. And the best way I always describe this live-attend analysis is to, go to your your dad's or grandfather's pickup truck and pull out the old atlas, and that mileage chart in the back, it reads like one of those mileage charts in the back of an old atlas. But what it does is it shows you how many students attend a school and where they live. And so it gives us an idea of, now we've built 6 years of data to show kind of the trends of where students live versus where they attend schools. Now we do it for every grade level. This one in particular shows your high schools. But what this can allow us to do in the future, and as we talk about recommendations in the future and the establishment of high quality programs at every high school, and eventually get to a point where every high school will have an established number of choice seats in it to allow a citywide program to be truly a citywide program across your schools. When we start talking about that, this live attend analysis becomes important because it helps us in analyzing why and where students come from. And now we can do it historically too. And not shocking enough, we see patterns. We know patterns out there. We know where students come from to go to schools and what attracts them, but that can change. Our past trail doesn't predict our future, but it gives us some ideas about why students have chosen what they chose. Now, when I look at this, I don't give it any judgment because I can't. I can tell you that there are kids that don't attend their neighborhood or their boundary high school because of program reasons, whether it's special education, whether it's for an art program, whether it's for the medical program, whether it's for whatever program it is. So it might be programmatic. I'm going to tell you also that where students live and how it's recorded and who records it, not here, but there are people that aren't honest about their addresses. And I know that's shocking to people, but that it's only as accurate as the data we can get. I will tell you that. But you guys actually aren't that rapid. I've seen districts that are really bad. You guys don't have that. But there are people that will use another address to make sure they just get to a school. People are savvy that way. We understand that. And, you know, in some ways you're like, well, you'd do anything for your kid, wouldn't you? And you know what? I would do anything for my kid. I mean, to an extent, I guess. But I think that we look at data knowing what it means and how we can interpret it, but we also know that there's no exact science to this. And there has to be some flexibility in our thoughts when we're looking at some of this data out there. But these numbers aren't made up. Matt Sachs is with me. He's our GIS analyst. He's probably doing some GIS right now in the district, looking at everything I'm talking about. Matt actually started with me here. Lee Huang came in, and then we just sent Lee out to Hawaii for a year to do some work. So Matt's been staying along with us, and Matt's going to do all the GIS analysis. I know, poor Lee. I know, poor Lee. Nobody feels sorry for him. But what Matt does is he takes every student and geocodes them on a map by their address match. We don't have students' names. All we have is IDs. And so we track every student every year where they live. So this number isn't some number we just plug in, and we're not counting. These aren't reported from schools or anything like that. We actually take the physical address and we geocode every year where students are. So this will be important. This will be really important as this development of the St. Paul's Quadrant, whatever happens here, to figure out what the impact of this will be. Because we've already started tracking, because we have to, this idea that there might be students that are moving out of there right now because they're uncertain of their housing future. So we want to see what the trends will be to where students get located or maybe forced to be located. That's important because as we're trying to plan for facilities and utilization and all that, as this whole redevelopment happens, it'll disperse and then it'll rebuild. And so there's some uncertainty as to how to do planning in really the central part of the city right now, from the school perspective, from a lot of different perspectives. And there's a lot of questions still in the air. This is helpful, but this can change. The condition assessment. So Jack Hasten is here tonight from HBA, and his firm, along with Mike Ross, did a physical assessment of every facility. What they did was they went through and determined by system, and I say a system, a system's anything you see in the building, the floor, the walls, lights, windows, roofs, all that. And they did a physical assessment of the building, both age and condition of facilities. And they roll up the measurement of that, and they then identify levels of priority. A priority 1 would be a life safety issue. So if you have something that is detrimental to life and safety in a building, that's a priority that needs fixed immediately. And I'm going to tell you, there's a lot of priority ones out there. And this doesn't mean kids are in danger when they walk into school. But I will tell you that we need to get those environments better for our children. Our schools are safe. They are safe. But as systems start to deteriorate, it's not things like that. It's those hidden safety things that you see. When roofs leak, they leave mold. And then they go undetected for years, that starts to be a problem for health and safety. We know that. That's just not here. That's everywhere. So we need to keep up with that. What was identified in this is 26 of 44 buildings exceed what we call the 2/3 rule. And the 2/3 rule in planning is this. When a building exceeds 2/3 the cost to renovate versus replace, it is a candidate for replacement. Now, the reason for that, and now it doesn't mean you close the building. It doesn't mean you have to replace the building. But the reason for that is the dollars that you invest in that building for renovation will have a shorter life than dollars in a new construction. Today, buildings, believe it or not, are back to a 70 or 80-year lifespan. You have a lot of 1950s and 60s buildings out there. They were built for 40 years. They're 60 years old now. So, but they were built intentionally very fast with lesser quality material because of the boom that happened after the war.
And if I can, I always laugh and say this to Tracy. I said I can take them up to New England and show them schools that were built in the 1800s that are still active. I had some of those in Worcester, so they built them to last even longer.
And I will tell you, in 20 years of doing this, we have kept more 1920s and 30s buildings than we have 1950s and 60s. You ain't tearing them down. They are built like they're built to last 200 years. You know, the issues that you find in buildings like that are they're less flexible. I mean, a lot of load bearing in those old buildings, but you're not going to tear them down. And they've got historic value. They've got all this, so all that has to come into play. So what they identified without and purposefully, there was no condition assessment done on Maury High School. And the reason for it is that there's a process going on to identify some things there. There's no condition assessment done on that. But we anticipate that it's probably no less than a Lake Taylor, which is $49 million in deficiencies. So you can take this 491 and you can bump it up to about 550 pretty quickly. Now, again, what does that mean in the context of things? You'd like to see a division that has an FCI between 30 and 40%. That means your buildings are in good shape, and relatively good shape, because you'll never get to zero, because you can't. But you want to maintain so the gap doesn't just keep getting bigger. So to give you some context of what it means to get bigger, is that this is an analysis it's a tool that we're going to continue to use when it comes to the funding ask as we move through in capital. So this is just kind of a quick analysis that makes an assumption that if we have $541 million in deficiencies, this is just deficiencies. This doesn't mean new construction, anything like that. So if that condition were to deteriorate at 2% a year, industry standards say the buildings deteriorate between 2 and 4% a year. I'm going to go on the low end of that and say that 541 continues to deteriorate at 2%. If you were to put in $6 million a year, which is higher than has been done traditionally, and you escalate that funding at 3%. So I'm going to deteriorate it slower than I'm going to give the increase in funding. After 10 years of planning, you will have spent, give or take, $70 million, and you will be $45 million worse off than you were before. So you're actually losing money in facilities. Unless something comes in and interjects a huge influx of cash to get rid of some of that condition. So what starts to happen is that because the number's so big right now, the gap just keeps getting bigger. And this is what districts, again, across the country do. Bond measures. They do things like, okay, we need $100 million for capital improvement. They go to the taxpayers and they ask. And where I come from in Ohio, it is a constant ask. We're on the ballot, my district's on the ballot every 3 years for capital improvement. It's just the ask that they've asked. They're on every 2 years for operating. We're conditioned to see that. But what happens is that when you make that big ask, you can put a big influx of cash into getting that deficiency down to start over again. Now, once again, we don't have any ability to do that as a school board because we get that funding from the city. And I will tell you that the city, in their budget, has other priorities, and we understand that. But to hold only the city accountable, especially in the Commonwealth, is wrong. The state needs to be held accountable. You've lost lottery funds, you've lost
Literary funds.
you've lost all these funds from the state level. In order to balance state budgets, they've passed it down to you guys. And so, and again, it's not really to blame, but when the economy's tough, the economy's tough. Roads and bridges take priorities. They just do. And so, even to make a bigger ask, and we continue to say, this isn't a stone throw across the street here. It's not that at all. It is simply, this is our problem. When we go to the city council, this is what we got. And so at the last one, I heard one of the board members ask Dr. Boone and Mr. Jordan, we gave you $10 million a few years ago. Where'd that go? It went there. And the number just kept getting bigger. Because $10 million across a $500 million plan is good to have. But to suggest that that money didn't go to the right appropriation for building condition, because it did. But it's a small dent in what we need. And so as we move forward, the idea is that we're more prepared to walk into city council and say, this is the reason we have the need. Now that we have this condition piece, we know the demographics, there's a vision for programming, we have the roadmap to where NPS really wants to be from its facility standpoint, aligning to the educational vision that you have. And this number is just, for me, it's just a number. How they address it and how we address this in the future, there's a lot of possibilities of options for funding out there. And I think we just have to work together to figure out what those solutions are. So there's no stone throwing, there's no blame. There is simply the fact that we have a condition issue in our facilities, and they need remedy. So the current draft recommendations that got proposed in June are this. As we look in the long term, as we look to keep those objectives up, the idea of two new or fully renovated high schools, in this case Booker T. Washington and Maury High School, are priorities. Roughly, in this case of new construction, somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 million. Between, and look, the goal right now is career and technical education, comprehensive career and technical education, choice of Booker T, working with that community to help develop that and the vision for that facility and how that's going to look is on the table. Replacing 2 elementary schools that could reduce the inventory of elementary schools by 5. So doing a smart consolidation, but doing it with state-of-the-art facilities that put schools actually where kids are. So now, I will tell you that in that one, as I shared with the board in June, is that you can actually reduce these facilities without new construction. You can do it with boundary changes. But I'm going to tell you that will be a hard ask in the community. To go out there and say, we're going to change these boundaries, and these kids are going to go to these schools, but the condition of the school that you're going to move into isn't any better than the school you're in today. It can be, programmatically we can get it right, but condition-wise I can't make that guarantee. So it's not necessarily that you have to build them, but in the long term, and even in the short term, it's more beneficial to invest that $50 million to get those schools where they belong and to get to the state-of-the-art education for those areas. The creation of 2 pre-K schools and a pre-K delivery model. So you'll hear soon Lake Taylor taking Fairlawn and Poplar Halls into Lake Taylor Middle School and converting that to a K-8 facility. As we see decline of enrollment into Lake Taylor Middle School because of the K-8, what used to be the feeder from the Compostela area, stay now in their middle school there, so you see the decline of enrollment. We have that, and then in the long term, and again, this one has probably the most ability to change, is to look at this area and take the local elementary schools into Ruffner and make it a K-8. So looking at Chesterfield, looking at Tidewater, and looking at those schools to create a K-8, because Ruffner continues to be, if you look at the number, Ruffner is utilized and has been utilized at 40-some% year after year. So changing the grade configuration, that would take 2 buildings offline that far exceed that 2/3 rule, so condition-wise. Now, the issue that we have with this, and this is well pointed out, is that those schools then create one school of real hyper-poverty. That those schools have a pronounced high free and reduced lunch count, and our goal isn't to perpetuate that. Now, with the change of this area, the St. Paul quadrant, that dynamic can change, but I don't know that answer. And so we know that this is more of a long-term, let's set this down the road. Let's put this on the back burner, and let's not do that yet. We want to see the dynamic of the change to happen. I know that's tough, and it's tough to have to be patient with that. But the patience will allow us to do really good stuff in this area. The net reduction of capital renewal deficiencies by about $127 million. So by the consolidation of these schools and by making this happen, we could take that 491 and we can take 125 million of that condition right off the top. That's a big number. They recommend a minimum spending requirement to maintain your current renewal. Estimated that the ask to maintain your current level is somewhere between 16 and 17 million a year, just to maintain. That's not new construction. That's just going to make sure that you keep the level of FCI you have today. This also does a nearly 100% feeder pattern to middle and high schools. The only exception would be Camp Allen and Sewell's Point. Now, but what it does is it just takes those two schools and takes them to a different middle school, still 100% of their school, to a different middle school, but they come back to the same high school. So the reason they don't have that 100% feeder is because we take them out of a middle school feeder. Capacity and location is a big reason for that. Geography dictates a lot of that one. And then finally, the balanced distribution of economically disadvantaged students. And we do that, and we can achieve that through better feeder patterns. Now, it starts at the middle grades. That's where it starts. We haven't made huge adjustments yet to elementary boundaries, but we're going to have to make those as we go through the transition in the next 5 years of how boundaries will look. And so, and the only one that you don't see on here, but we had a board work session on it, was a review of transportation. This board has been introduced to the idea of transitioning from a 4-tiered bus system to a 3-tiered bus system. Literally millions of dollars of savings by doing it, but has a huge impact on start times. So, but the benefits, and you do research, and so what the plan is as we go through this fall, looking at that, is to give you research-proven benefits and challenges of doing systems like that. But again, in transparency, and it's been out there, that the idea would be to take the high school switch and take them to the last start time and elementary starting. So it would free up a ton of buses. We would actually, you have kids on the bus right now that get on a bus at 5:30 in the morning, believe it or not, for high school. 5:30 in the morning. And this, because of the elementary transportation routes, we could literally bring that to the first kid get on a bus nearly 7 o'clock in the morning. And then keeping about the same end times of the day because transportation is so much more efficient. And just the dollar savings. So there are benefits. The challenges is that dealing with things like, and they're real, athletics. How do you do high schools when they start later? Then program alignment about, if we're going to do that. And there's all those challenges that you have. But just because it has challenges and just because everybody doesn't think it's a great idea doesn't mean you don't explore it. And so I think that there's real benefit to the division to look at this. And to not look at it would be literally leaving millions of dollars on the table. But that's going to demand community engagement, feedback from the community, understanding the implications and how to put that into practice. So our planning schedule for the fall is that our planning really comes into implementation of the things that you just saw. We can't do everything, certainly, but the plan is that, and there's a tentative schedule in the front of your book that looks at how this is laid out. But the intent is that we want to explore with the community, the first round of community engagement, a continued education informational session to get feedback on what has been presented. Take their temperature. This is what the board is saying. What are you thinking? Do you think we're way off base? Do you think this can work? And so for us, it gives us a measure of how much and how quickly we can make change in planning. We're going to work with the task force through the fall to keep us in check with data and all that. We want to go back to the community in late, like October, November, when we get more solid on our recommendations and get feedback on those specific recommendations for the board to see, okay, what can we do and what can't we do? And then work through December and January to come up with an implementation plan for 1920. And then it'll have a short term for 1920, and then it'll have the next stages of your planning and what we have to be doing in those years. So like I said, part of it will be boundary planning. implementation of boundary planning. Are there boundaries that we can move now? Are there feeders that we can move now? That we can make the transition without capital improvement, without new construction, without significant boundary change. That will be one of the discussions we have. So, and then set a pathway this fall for when that will occur. The other thing we'll be looking at is we will be engaging the Lake Taylor community about the transition to a K-8 school. That's one of the big things on our agenda to make sure we do. Although not on the schedule yet, and figuring out, and I'll work with Dr. Boone on this, is the engagement with the Booker T. Washington community about the CTE program and the facility side to that. They're working programmatically in the background. Dr. Boone has spoken extensively about that in public meeting. But it will be applying that to the facility that we're, much like the Morey process, adapted to the Booker T community to make sure that their needs are met there. But remember, and I just so happen to run in the PTA president today from Booker T, and she is adamant, this is a city school. This is for every child to share. But maintain our history and maintain the integrity of what the school's about. Those are good goals. And so I was excited to talk to her about this. And so we have to engage that community in a thoughtful process that's meaningful. That's not on the schedule yet to do, but we're going to get that on the schedule. And so there's a lot of implementation work to do this fall. And but it's going to be, as we meet, and there are board updates continuously. How often you call me, I'm here. If we need to do more frequent, whether it's a board work session, typically board work sessions tend to be a better work environment for this specific topic, to help direct on if there's things that you see in recommendations that we can't move on because you don't want to as a board, tell us. Then we just won't move on that in the board. But there are things that are necessary to get in front of as we do this planning. And so that's what our fall looks like, not a non-busy fall. And so that's kind of how we got from there to here. And I will open to how much time you have. And
A few minutes for questions, and I'd like to open it up for questions.
And just real quick, if you don't mind, emailing Dr. Boone to me works for question and answer, and you can all have my email address too. But I work specifically with Dr. Bailey's office and Dennis Fuddy. Any of that communication to your discretion is always welcome, because I know we don't have a lot of time here.
No, I'm good.
Okay. Questions from the board?
I don't have a question, but I have a comment. So the author Ivan Van Sertima, who wrote a book called They Came Before Columbus. And so I often like to talk about what came before Tracy. And so as he was describing the demographic and educational planning piece of it, he's right. But prior to that, it tied to some strategic planning work. We've talked about the strategic plan, the fact that the 5-year strategic plan is sunsetting. So we pulled together, or the division pulled together, a broad group of stakeholders. And if you look at the strategic plan and look at some of the initiatives and look at some of the goals, part of the discussion was, how do we get this done? And so that resulted in the RFP that led to then Gian Richter and now Cooperative Strategies coming forward. But all that ties back to those tough, rough conversations that we had at a community level and as a board level that set down this path that's been unfolding for the last 4 or 5 years. Deep in research and data, we looked at data that showed some predictions around on-time graduation rates based upon where you started elementary school and how that seemed to tie to neighborhood and poverty and some other things. And the conversation was, how do we break that up? And also, how do we provide more rigorous opportunities for any child in the city? And one of the original outcomes of that was the Academy for Discovery at Lakewood emerged from that. And then we worked on and still are working on the Southside STEM Academy at Compostela, also emerged from that. And some of those pairings that now he's talking about, maybe we should revisit based upon whether or not it's achieving the outcomes that we described. So I just wanted to say it started with our strategic planning process and our conversations as a board on how we were going to achieve the goals that we set. And the real idea was if you bring in a firm from the outside, then if it all fails, you can bring the firm. So
That's happened. That's okay.
Right. Well, thank you very much for coming. If you do have any questions, just email Dr. Boone, and I guess go ahead and include everyone so that way we can all be up to speed on what you ask. That way someone else might have the same question. So have a safe flight back, and we'll be in touch.
Appreciate it.
Madam Chair, one other thing, you may want to mention if you are maintaining an online site with FAQs and other things where people can go and get.
Yep,
get
so
past
every year as we
information.
start planning again, we keep a website for the project, okay? So we will kind of reboot the 2018-19 planning schedule and all that, and we try to keep that online and updated. So as we meet with, like, the steering committee, typically the next day, you'll be able to pull up the agenda and the presentation that we did, so you can see what they did and they worked in. So take 5 minutes to just keep you, that way you don't have to spend hours.
Can you send us out the
We will-
link to
yeah,
that
we will do
website?
We'll send that link. Thank you, Mr. Jordan, for that. A lot to try to tell you.
I know. So let me ask everyone if you're okay. We were kind of looking at the time that we had in the agenda. We're good.
Okay, thank you.
And for the academic accountability update, if we could move that into the discussion portion of the business meeting. That way it'll give folks some time to change the room up and get ready for our business meeting.
And Madam Chair, that's a very brief discussion. It's going to lay out timelines and expectations, so it won't be a long discussion.
Okay.
Danny.
Okay, thank you. Is everyone okay if we move that? Okay, thanks. So we'll go ahead and just take a 15-minute break and then come back 7 o'clock sharp.
I assume we need to take everything off this table.
Yes,
Break it up
everything
and
off.
just move it over to our other place.